The crystal chandeliers of Le Bistro threw dancing shadows across Maxwell Rothschild III's perfectly tailored Armani suit as he drummed his fingers impatiently on the white linen tablecloth. His father's words from their heated argument that morning still rang in his ears. "You've never worked for anything in your life. Maxwell, you have no idea what real responsibility means." The memory made his jaw clench. At 28, Maxwell was tired of being treated like an irresponsible child by his father, even if his track record of costly mistakes and tabloid scandals gave the old man plenty of ammunition. This time was different. Though this time he would prove himself worthy of taking over as CEO of Rothschild Industries. "I'm so sorry for the wait, sir." A gentle voice interrupted his brooding. "We're short-staffed tonight." Maxwell looked up, ready to unleash his frustration on the tardy server, but the words died in his throat. The waitress standing beside his table wasn't what he expected in this five-star establishment. She was young, probably mid-20s, with warm brown eyes and a genuine smile that seemed to brighten the dimly lit restaurant. Her name tag read Sarah. "It's fine," he found himself saying, surprising even himself with his uncharacteristic patience. There was something different about her, an authenticity that stood out in stark contrast to the artificial politeness he was accustomed to in these high-end venues. "Would you like to hear today's specials?" Sarah asked, maintaining her warm demeanor despite the visible exhaustion in her eyes. As she recited the menu with perfect precision, Maxwell noticed small details. The slight tremor in her hands, suggesting hours on her feet, the way she shifted her weight to ease the pressure on her legs, and most intriguingly, the small paint stains on her fingertips that the dim lighting barely revealed. "The chef recommends the duck confit," she finished. "Though personally, I think the sea base is exceptional tonight." "You've tried it?" Maxwell asked, genuinely curious. It wasn't common for waitstaff to sample the expensive menu items. A slight blush colored her cheeks. "The chef lets us taste new dishes so we can better describe them to guests. It helps us do our jobs better." There was pride in her voice, not the arrogant kind Maxwell was familiar with, but something more fundamental, more real. It intrigued him. "I'll take your recommendation then," he said, handing her the menu. "The sea base." As Sarah walked away, Maxwell found his eyes following her. She moved with purpose, efficiently handling multiple tables while maintaining that genuine warmth with each guest. It was a stark contrast to his own life, where everything had always been handed to him on a silver platter. His phone buzzed with a message from his father. "Meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. Time to discuss your future at the company." Maxwell's grip tightened on his phone. His father had made it clear that this was his last chance to prove himself worthy of the Rothschild legacy. One more scandal, one more failure, and he would be cut off. The threat had seemed hollow before. His father had made similar ultimatums in the past, but something felt different this time. The sea base arrived perfectly presented, and true to Sarah's word, it was exceptional. Throughout the meal, he found himself watching her interact with other guests, noticing how she seemed to anticipate their needs before they even realized them themselves. There was an intelligence in her movements, a quiet competence that spoke of someone who understood the value of hard work. As she brought his check at the end of the meal, Maxwell made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Sarah?" he said, catching her attention before she could walk away. "I know this is forward, but would you have dinner with me sometime? Not here, obviously, but somewhere of your choosing?" The surprise on her face was genuine, followed quickly by hesitation. "I'm flattered, Mr. Rothschild, but I don't date customers. It's not professional." Maxwell blinked, taken aback. Not by the rejection itself. He'd rarely been rejected in his life, but by the fact that she knew who he was and still said no. Most women would have jumped at the chance to date a Rothschild. "How did you know my name?" Sarah's smile held a hint of amusement. "Your reservation, of course. And the society pages aren't exactly subtle about covering your adventures." There was no judgment in her tone, but Maxwell felt the sting anyway. His reputation preceded him, and not in a good way. What if I could prove to you I'm not just what you've read about? The words came out before he could stop them, surprising him with their sincerity. Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. I appreciate the offer, but my life is complicated enough without adding a dinner date with a famous playboy to the mix. I have responsibilities that don't leave much room for adventures. As she turned to leave, Maxwell caught a glimpse of something falling from her pocket. A small, colorful drawing done in crayon. "Wait!" he called out, picking up the paper. "You dropped this!" Sarah turned back quickly, relief washing over her face as she took the drawing. "Thank you," she said softly, carefully tucking it back into her pocket. "One of my students made it for me." "Students?" "Yes, I teach first grade at Hamilton Elementary during the day. This is my second job." The revelation hit Maxwell like a physical blow. 2 jobs? Teaching children by day and serving entitled people like him by night. The concept was so foreign to his privileged existence that he could barely process it. "Why 2 jobs?" he asked before he could stop himself. Something flickered in Sarah's eyes, pride mixed with determination. "Because teaching doesn't pay enough to support my family, and my brother's medical bills won't pay themselves." She straightened her shoulders slightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other tables to attend to." As Maxwell watched her walk away, his father's words echoed in his mind again. "You've never worked for anything in your life." Looking down at the check, he made a decision. He left a tip that equaled the cost of the meal itself, but for the first time in his life, throwing money at something didn't feel like enough. He pulled out his phone and Googled Hamilton Elementary School. Tomorrow's meeting with his father would have to wait. Maxwell Rothschild III had just found someone worth proving himself for, and for once his bank account alone wouldn't be enough to get what he wanted. Maxwell's Mercedes-Benz stood out like a sore thumb in the parking lot of Hamilton Elementary School. He checked his Patek Philippe watch, 7:45 a.m. The schoolyard was already alive with children's voices, their energy a stark contrast to the corporate world he was supposed to be in. He spotted Sarah immediately. She wore a simple floral dress and comfortable flats, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a far cry from her elegant restaurant uniform. She was helping a small boy with his backpack, kneeling to meet him at eye level. The genuine care in her expression made something twist in Maxwell's chest. Sarah froze when she saw him approaching. "Mr. Rothschild," she said, straightening up. "This is unexpected." "Maxwell, please," he said, suddenly aware of how out of place his Italian leather shoes and custom suit looked on the cracked concrete of the schoolyard. "I wanted to see where you work." "Where I work?" Sarah's tone held a hint of steel beneath its professional courtesy. "Or where you can find me, since I turned you down last night." Before Maxwell could respond, his phone buzzed aggressively. His father's name flashed on the screen. The 9 a.m. meeting. He was going to miss it completely. Sarah watched him silence the call, her expression unreadable. "Shouldn't you be somewhere else?" "Probably," Maxwell admitted. "But I'm exactly where I want to be. I'd like to understand your world, Sarah. Maybe even help if I can." "Help?" Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Mr. Rothschild, Maxwell, my world isn't a charity case for you to throw money at. These kids need consistency, dedication, and hard work, things that can't be bought." The words stung, but Maxwell stood his ground. "Then teach me. Let me volunteer here. I'll do whatever you need, grade papers, clean classrooms, anything." Sarah stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. "You want to volunteer? You?" "I know it sounds crazy," Maxwell said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, "but I've spent my whole life being handed things. Maybe it's time I learned what it means to earn something." Before Sarah could respond, a small voice piped up beside them. "Ms. Thompson, is he your boyfriend?" Sarah blushed furiously as a little girl with braids looked up at them with wide eyes. "No, Lucy, Mr. Rothschild is just visiting." "He looks like a prince," Lucy declared with the brutal honesty of a 6-year-old. "But his shoes are silly. You can't play on the playground with those shoes." Maxwell looked down at his $2,000 Oxford shoes and couldn't help but laugh. You're absolutely right. Lucy, these are silly shoes for a playground. The first bell rang, sending children scurrying toward the building. Sarah gathered her students with practiced efficiency, but before heading inside, she turned to Maxwell. Come back tomorrow, she said. 7:30 a.m. Wear practical shoes and clothes you don't mind getting dirty. And Maxwell? Don't be late. As Sarah led her class inside, Maxwell's phone buzzed again. 14 missed calls from his father, 3 from the board members. His absence from the meeting would have consequences, but watching Sarah with her students, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The desire to earn respect rather than demand it. The next morning, Maxwell arrived at Hamilton Elementary at 7:15 a.m., wearing jeans and sneakers he'd had to buy specifically for this purpose. His father had been livid about the missed meeting, threatening to cut him off immediately. Only Maxwell's promise of a new approach to proving himself had stayed his father's hand. You're early, Sarah said, appearing beside him with a stack of construction paper and art supplies. Good, you can help set up the art station for today's lesson on shapes. For the next hour, Maxwell Rothschild III, heir to a billion-dollar empire, cut circles, squares and triangles out of colored paper, while sitting at a tiny desk meant for first graders. His cuts weren't straight, and his corners weren't perfect, but with each mistake, Sarah patiently showed him how to improve. The kids will be here soon, Sarah said, checking the clock. Are you sure you want to stay? It's not too late to go back to your board meetings and business deals. Maxwell looked at his uneven stack of shapes, then at Sarah. I'm staying, though I should warn you, I'm probably going to be terrible at this. Sarah's smile held a warmth he was beginning to crave. Everyone's terrible at first, Maxwell. What matters is that you're willing to learn. The day that followed was unlike anything Maxwell had ever experienced. He watched Sarah transform from the quiet, efficient waitress into an engaging teacher who managed to keep 26 first graders focused and excited about learning. She knew each child's strengths and struggles, adapting her approach seamlessly to meet their needs. During art time, Maxwell found himself surrounded by children asking for help, even though his shapes were barely passable. Their enthusiasm was infectious, their gratitude immediate and genuine when he managed to help them create something they were proud of. Ms. Thompson, one little boy called out, holding up his project. Look what Mr. Max helped me make. The construction paper creation was messy, with glue everywhere and shapes slightly askew, but the pride in the boy's voice made it seem like a masterpiece. Sarah came over to admire it, and her eyes met Maxwell's over the child's head. That's beautiful, Tommy, she said, but she was looking at Maxwell with something new in her expression, respect. At lunch break, while the kids were in the cafeteria, Maxwell helped Sarah clean up the morning's art supplies. His hands were covered in glue and bits of paper, his expensive watch protected by a layer of construction paper scraps. Why are you really here, Maxwell? Sarah asked quietly. And don't say it's just to impress me. Maxwell paused, considering his answer carefully, because yesterday, watching you with these kids, I realized something. You create actual value in the world. You shape lives. All I've ever done is spend money and chase the next thrill, and that bothers you now. It should have bothered me a long time ago, he admitted. My father's right. I've never worked for anything in my life. But seeing you manage 2 jobs, pour your heart into teaching these kids, take care of your family, it makes me want to be better, to actually earn respect, instead of demanding it because of my last name. Sarah was quiet for a moment, wiping glue off a desk. Your father, she said finally, the missed meeting yesterday, will there be consequences? Maxwell's laugh was hollow. Probably, but for the first time in my life, I think I'm ready to face them. Being here, helping these kids, watching you work, it matters more than another lecture about responsibility from my father. Teaching isn't glamorous, Sarah warned, and neither is waiting tables. Both jobs require sacrificing your pride multiple times a day. Maybe that's exactly what I need, Maxwell said softly. A lesson in humility. The afternoon brought new challenges. Maxwell found himself reading storybooks aloud, attempting different voices for characters, while 26 first graders critiqued his performance with brutal honesty. He helped clean up spilled juice, tied shoelaces, and learned that managing a line of 6-year-olds required more diplomacy than any business negotiation he'd ever been part of. By the time the last child was picked up, Maxwell was exhausted in a way he'd never experienced before. His back ached from sitting in tiny chairs. His clothes were stained with markers and glue, and he couldn't stop smiling. "You survived," Sarah said, organizing papers at her desk. "I'm impressed." "Barely," Maxwell admitted. "How do you do this every day, then go work another job?" "Because it matters," she said simply. "These kids matter. My brother's health matters. Some things are worth being exhausted for." Maxwell watched her pack up her bag, knowing she had to head to Bistro soon for another long shift. "Let me drive you to the restaurant," he offered. "Please, you look tired." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but just a ride? This doesn't change anything else." As they walked to his car, Maxwell's phone buzzed yet again. This time, it wasn't his father, but his assistant, warning him that the board was calling an emergency meeting to discuss his future at the company. Looking at Sarah's determined profile as she walked beside him, Maxwell made a decision that would either save or destroy his position in his father's company. But either way, he knew it would make him a better person. "Sarah," he said, opening the car door for her, "I have an idea, but I'll need your help. Would you be willing to teach me one more lesson?" "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly, standing in the empty classroom the next morning. "I can't accept that kind of money." "Maxwell, it wouldn't be right." Maxwell had just outlined his plan, a charitable foundation focused on supporting teachers who worked second jobs, starting with those at Hamilton Elementary. The foundation would provide supplemental income to allow them to focus solely on teaching. "It's not charity," Maxwell insisted. "It's an investment in education. Think about how much more you could do for these kids if you weren't exhausted from working double shifts." Sarah's eyes flashed. "And what about everyone else? All the other teachers working second and third jobs? All the families struggling with medical bills like my brother's? You can't solve systemic problems by throwing money at one school." "Then we'll start here and expand," Maxwell said, his enthusiasm growing. "This could be a pilot program. If it works, we can implement it across the city, maybe even nationally. But I need your help to make it work." Before Sarah could respond, a knock at the classroom door interrupted them. A tall young man stood there, leaning heavily on a cane. His resemblance to Sarah was striking, despite his gaunt appearance. "Eric!" Sarah rushed to help her brother into the room. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." "Forgot your lunch," Eric said, holding up a paper bag. His voice was weak, but his eyes were sharp as they landed on Maxwell. "Though I see you have company." Maxwell stepped forward, extending his hand. "Maxwell Rothschild. I'm a volunteer." Eric's handshake was surprisingly firm. "A Rothschild volunteering at a public elementary school? Now that's something you don't see every day." "Eric," Sarah warned, but her brother just smiled. "What? I'm just saying it's interesting. Almost as interesting as him following you from Bistro to here." At Sarah's surprised look, he added, "Lucy's mom is my nurse. She told me about the fancy man in the expensive suit who's been hanging around." Maxwell watched the siblings' interaction with fascination. Despite Eric's obvious physical weakness, there was a protective strength in how he carried himself, especially regarding his sister. "The foundation isn't just about teachers," Maxwell said suddenly. "It could help with medical expenses too. Create a safety net for families dealing with long-term health issues." Eric's expression hardened. "We don't need your pity, Mr. Rothschild." "It's not pity," Maxwell insisted, his voice passionate. "Look, I've spent my whole life taking things for granted. Money, health, opportunities. I never had to think twice about any of it. But seeing how hard Sarah works, understanding what your family deals with, it's opened my eyes." He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he'd never quite overcome. "My father's company has a healthcare division that's been sitting stagnant for years. He wanted me to prove I could lead, to show I understand responsibility. What better way than by turning that division into something that actually helps people? Sarah and Eric exchanged a look that spoke volumes about years of shared struggles. "And what happens when you get bored?" Eric asked bluntly. "When this little adventure in philanthropy doesn't excite you anymore? What happens to all the people depending on your help then?" Maxwell felt the weight of their skepticism, but instead of his usual defensive reaction, he found himself understanding it. He'd given them no reason to trust his commitment to anything. "That's why I need Sarah's help," he said quietly. "Not just with the foundation, but with understanding what it really means to commit to something bigger than yourself. I've watched her with these kids, seen how she puts their needs first, even when she's exhausted. I want to learn that kind of dedication." The first bell rang, signaling the approaching start of the school day. Eric struggled to stand, waving off Sarah's attempt to help. "I should go," he said, then turned to Maxwell. "Mr. Rothschild, if you're serious about this foundation, I suggest you spend some time in the hospital, where I get my treatments. See what families really go through when they're trying to keep someone alive." Maxwell nodded solemnly. "I'd like that if you're willing to show me." After Eric left, Sarah began preparing for her student's arrival, but her movements were distracted, thoughtful. "He's getting worse," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The new treatment protocol isn't working as well as we hoped, and the insurance, they're fighting us on covering it." Maxwell stepped closer, wanting to comfort her but unsure how. "Let me help, Sarah. Not with money directly, but by creating something sustainable. Something that could help families like yours for years to come." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Why are you really doing this, Maxwell? Is it just to prove something to your father?" "To me, maybe it started that way," he admitted. "But seeing you with these kids, meeting Eric, understanding what real struggle looks like, it's changing me. For the first time in my life, I want to do something that matters." The sound of children's voices in the hallway grew louder. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "Come to the hospital with us tomorrow," she said. "Eric has treatment at 10 a.m. See what it's really like. Then we can talk about your foundation." The next morning found Maxwell walking through the oncology ward, the sterile hospital environment, a far cry from both the elementary school and his usual luxurious surroundings. He watched as Eric endured his treatment, saw Sarah sitting beside her brother, grading papers while simultaneously keeping him entertained with stories about her students. Other families in the ward caught his attention too. Parents sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, children trying to do homework while attached to IV lines, elderly couples counting out pills with worried expressions. Each scene was a stark reminder of how sheltered his own life had been. During a moment when Eric was sleeping and Sarah had stepped out to make a phone call to the school's substitute teacher, a young mother in the next chair over caught Maxwell's attention. "You're him, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "The Rothschild heir. I've seen your picture in magazines." Maxwell nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, but I'm just here as a friend." The woman smiled sadly. "Must be nice not having to worry about choosing between your child's medicine and your rent." The comment hit Maxwell like a physical blow. He looked at her son, a boy no older than Sarah's students, playing quietly with a worn action figure. "How do you manage?" he asked softly. "We don't, really," she admitted. "We just take it day by day, hoping something will change before we lose everything." When Sarah returned, she found Maxwell deep in conversation with the woman, taking notes on his phone about the specific challenges families faced during long-term medical treatments. That evening, after Eric's treatment was finished and Sarah had left for her shift at Bistro, Maxwell sat in his car in the hospital parking lot, his mind racing with possibilities. He pulled out his phone and dialed his father's number. "Dad," he said when the older man answered, "I'm ready for that board meeting now, but it's not going to be the presentation you expected. I have a different vision for the healthcare division, and I need you to hear me out." His father's silence was heavy with skepticism. "Maxwell, if this is another one of your impulsive schemes, It's not, Maxwell interrupted. For the first time in my life, Dad, I understand what you've been trying to teach me about responsibility, about using our position to make real change. Just give me one chance to prove it. After a long pause, his father sighed. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp. Don't be late this time. Maxwell ended the call and started his car, heading not home, but to Le Bistro. He needed to talk to Sarah first, to make sure his plan would truly help people like her and Eric, not just look good on paper. As he pulled into the restaurant parking lot, his phone buzzed with a text from Eric. Whatever you're planning, don't hurt my sister. She believes in you now. Don't make her regret it. Maxwell stared at the message for a long moment, feeling the weight of trust being placed in him, perhaps for the first time in his life. He couldn't mess this up. Too many people would be counting on him to follow through. The Rothschild Industries boardroom fell silent as Maxwell finished his presentation. Gone was his usual casual demeanor, replaced by a passionate intensity none of them had seen before. The projector displayed the final slide of his comprehensive plan to revolutionize the company's healthcare division. This isn't just about profits, Maxwell concluded, his voice firm. It's about creating sustainable change. The Teacher Support Initiative, combined with the Medical Care Access Program, could transform thousands of lives while also positioning Rothschild Industries as a leader in corporate social responsibility. His father, Richard Rothschild, leaned forward in his chair at the head of the table. You're proposing to cut our profit margins significantly in the healthcare division. The shareholders won't like that. Short-term, yes, Maxwell acknowledged, but look at the projected community impact numbers. The goodwill and brand loyalty this would generate could open up new markets we've never been able to access. More importantly, it's the right thing to do. Richard's expression remained unreadable. And this sudden interest in social responsibility, it wouldn't have anything to do with a certain teacher at Hamilton Elementary. Maxwell felt the eyes of every board member on him. In the past, he might have deflected with a joke or become defensive. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and met his father's gaze directly. Sarah Thompson showed me what real dedication looks like, he said honestly. But this isn't about impressing her. It's about becoming someone I can respect when I look in the mirror. Before his father could respond, Maxwell's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Eric collapsed at work, at Memorial Hospital. It's bad. Maxwell's heart stopped. He looked at his father, then at the phone, torn between his professional obligations and his growing feelings for Sarah. Go, his father said suddenly, surprising everyone. The board needs time to review your proposal anyway. Dad, Maxwell, his father's voice softened slightly. For the first time in your life, you've put together a serious business proposal that thinks beyond yourself. Don't ruin this moment by staying here when someone you care about needs you. 20 minutes later, Maxwell ran through the hospital corridors, his tie loose and his perfect suit wrinkled. He found Sarah in the emergency room waiting area, her face pale but composed. Sarah, he called out softly. She looked up, and something in her broke. Maxwell reached her just as her carefully maintained composure crumbled. She fell into his arms, her body shaking with silent sobs. The new treatment, she managed between breaths. It's not just not working anymore, it's making him worse. The doctors, they say we need to try something experimental, but the insurance, we can't. Maxwell held her tighter, his mind racing. He could easily pay for any treatment Eric needed, but he knew Sarah would reject a direct offer of money. She had too much pride, too much integrity to accept what she'd see as charity. The foundation, he said suddenly. Sarah, if the board approves my proposal, the Medical Care Access Program could help Eric. He could be one of our first participants. Sarah pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes. Maxwell, the board meeting, you left it because of us? Some things are more important than business meetings, he said simply. A doctor approached them then, his expression serious. Ms. Thompson, your brother is stabilized, but we need to make some decisions about his care moving forward. The next few hours were a blur of medical terminology and difficult conversations. Maxwell stayed by Sarah's side, taking notes, asking questions, and providing quiet support. He watched her navigate the complicated medical decisions with the same grace and strength she showed in her classroom. Late that night, with Eric finally resting comfortably, Sarah and Maxwell sat in the hospital cafeteria. The coffee was terrible, but neither of them noticed. "I saw your presentation," Sarah said quietly. "Before I left for work this morning, you left it open on your laptop yesterday." Maxwell tensed. "And? It's good, Maxwell. Really good. You've thought about everything, not just the obvious problems, but the subtle ones too. The dignity of the people you're trying to help, the sustainability of the programs." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You've changed. Because of you," he said, turning his hand to hold hers. "You showed me what it means to truly care about something beyond myself." Sarah's phone buzzed, a reminder that she had class in the morning. Maxwell watched her check the time with exhausted eyes. "Let me help," he said softly. "Not with money, not directly. But let me be here for you and Eric. Let me show you that I can be someone who makes things better, not just someone who throws money at problems." Sarah looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. "I'm starting to believe you already are that person, Maxwell." The moment was interrupted by another doctor, this one carrying test results that would require immediate decisions. As they rushed back to Eric's room, Maxwell's phone buzzed with an email from his father. "Board meeting reconvenes tomorrow, 8 a.m. Your proposal has merit, but there are concerns. Be prepared to defend it. And Maxwell, I'm proud of how you handled yourself today, both in the boardroom and after." Maxwell looked at Sarah, who was already deep in discussion with the doctor about Eric's treatment options. He thought about the board meeting, about his father's praise, about how different his priorities were now compared to just a few weeks ago. The next morning found Maxwell back in the boardroom, his presentation refined based on what he'd learned at the hospital. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for his position in the company or even for Sarah's approval. He was fighting for Eric, for the mother with the sick child he'd met during treatment, for every family facing impossible choices between medicine and rent. "Before we begin," his father said, "the board has some concerns about the financial implications of your proposal." Maxwell stood, straightening his tie. "With respect to the board, I'd like to share something I learned yesterday about what financial implications really mean to the families we could help." As he began speaking, Maxwell felt a strength he'd never known before. This wasn't about proving himself anymore. It was about using his position to create real change. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to fight for something bigger than himself. But even as he made his case to the board, a question nagged at the back of his mind. If the board rejected his proposal, would he have the courage to walk away from his inheritance and find another way to help Sarah, Eric, and all the others who needed it? The answer, he realized, would define not just his future, but the man he was becoming. 6 months later, Maxwell stood in the doorway of Sarah's classroom, watching as she helped her students with their art projects. The scene was familiar now, but it never failed to warm his heart. Construction paper and glue sticks were scattered across tiny desks, and the walls were covered with children's artwork, including several pieces proudly labeled, "Helped by Mr. Max." "Ms. Thompson," a little girl called out, holding up her creation. "Is this good enough for the hospital?" Sarah smiled warmly. "It's beautiful, Emma. I'm sure it will brighten someone's day." The art project was part of the new Healing Hearts program, where students made decorations for the pediatric ward at Memorial Hospital. It was just one of many changes that had swept through both the school and the hospital in recent months. Maxwell's mind drifted back to that pivotal board meeting. He'd been prepared to fight, to argue, to defend his vision for the company's future. Instead, his father had surprised everyone. "The board has reviewed your proposal extensively," Richard had said, standing to address the room. "We've also done some investigation of our own." Maxwell's assessment of the potential impact is, if anything, conservative, but more importantly, He'd paused, looking directly at his son. More importantly, we've seen a transformation in leadership capability that proves he's ready for this responsibility. The Teacher Support Initiative had been approved first, allowing Sarah and dozens of other teachers to focus solely on their students without the strain of second jobs. The Medical Care Access Program had followed, with Eric as one of its first participants. Now, watching Sarah with her class, Maxwell thought about how much had changed. His Armani suits had given way to more practical clothing, though he still occasionally overdressed for classroom volunteer duties. His priorities had shifted from impressing others to making a genuine difference. "Mr. Max," Tommy's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can you help me with my card? I want it to be extra special for the sick kids." Maxwell joined the boy at his tiny desk, carefully helping him fold the paper. "Why extra special, Tommy?" "Because," Tommy said seriously, "Ms. Thompson told us that sometimes being sick is scary, and nice things can make people feel better. Like how you helped her brother get better." Maxwell's throat tightened with emotion. Eric's recovery had been a journey, one that was still ongoing, but the experimental treatment was working. More importantly, dozens of other families were now receiving similar support through the program. Sarah appeared beside them, placing a gentle hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "Tommy's right," she said softly. "Nice things and nice people can make all the difference." Later that afternoon, after the children had gone home, Maxwell helped Sarah clean up the classroom. It had become their ritual, these quiet moments among scattered art supplies and tiny chairs. "I got the latest report from the foundation today," he said, collecting stray crayons. "We've helped over 200 families so far, and the teacher retention rate at supported schools has increased by 60%. Sarah smiled, but her expression was thoughtful. "You know what amazes me most? Not the numbers, impressive as they are. It's how you've changed, Maxwell. The man I met at Bistro wouldn't recognize who you are now." "I hope not," Maxwell chuckled. "That guy was pretty awful." "No," Sarah corrected him gently. "He just needed to find something worth fighting for, something bigger than himself." Maxwell set down the crayons and took her hands in his. "I found someone worth becoming better for. You showed me what real strength looks like, Sarah. Not the kind that comes from money or power, but the kind that comes from dedication, from caring about others more than yourself." "We showed each other," Sarah said, squeezing his hands. "You taught me that it's okay to accept help sometimes, that not all change comes with strings attached." The classroom door opened, and Eric walked in, not with his old cane, but standing tall and strong. His recovery wasn't complete, but he was teaching part-time at the community college now, sharing his own story to inspire others. "Are you two having another moment?" he teased. "Because the foundation board meeting starts in 30 minutes, and I'd rather not have to explain why our executive director and head of educational programs are late." Maxwell laughed. After stepping down as heir to Rothschild Industries' main operations, he'd taken charge of the foundation instead. It was a decision that had surprised many, but not those who knew him best. Sarah had joined as the educational director, bringing her classroom experience to help shape programs that really worked for teachers and students. "You know," Eric said, leaning against a desk, "I never thought I'd say this, but you proved me wrong, Maxwell. When you first showed up here in your fancy suit, talking about changing the world, I thought it was just another rich guy's phase." "It could have been," Maxwell admitted, "if Sarah hadn't shown me what real dedication looks like. If you hadn't trusted me enough to let me try." Sarah gathered her things, a familiar warmth in her eyes. "Ready to go change more lives?" Maxwell looked around the classroom one last time, at the children's artwork, the tiny chairs, the place where his transformation had begun. "You know what I learned here? Between the construction paper and medical bills, life isn't about what you have or what you can get. It's about what you can give and how you can help others grow." "Pretty profound for a guy who used to think happiness could be bought," Eric teased. "Oh, I still think money is important," Maxwell said with a grin. It's just better when it's used to lift others up instead of looking down on them. They walked out together. The teacher who had taught him the value of honest work, the brother who had shown him the meaning of resilience, and the man he had become through their influence. The foundation meeting awaited, with new challenges and opportunities to help others. That evening, as Maxwell sat in his office reviewing applications for the next round of program participants, he found himself thinking about his father's words from so long ago. "You've never worked for anything in your life." How wrong that was now. Every day was work, meaningful, fulfilling work that left him exhausted but proud. His desk held no expensive trinkets anymore, just children's artwork and thank you letters from families the foundation had helped. His designer suits hung largely unused, replaced by clothes more suitable for classroom visits and hospital rounds. But his smile was genuine now, his purpose clear. A knock at his door revealed Sarah, holding 2 cups of coffee. Not the expensive kind he used to insist on, but the simple brew from the teacher's lounge. "Thought you might need this," she said. "We have a lot of families counting on us." Maxwell took the coffee, pulling her close with his free arm. "You know what, Sarah? For the first time in my life, I wouldn't have it any other way." The sun was setting outside his window, casting a warm glow over the city. Somewhere out there, teachers were focusing on their students instead of second jobs. Families were getting the medical care they needed, and children were creating art to brighten hospital rooms. It wasn't the life Maxwell had been born into, but it was the one he had chosen, the one he had earned through hard work, compassion, and love. And that, he had learned, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. Have you ever seen someone completely transform for love? What would you do if you had the power to change the lives of hundreds of people? Share your opinion in the comments. Your perspective matters to us, and we love reading each of your responses. If this story touched your heart, don't miss the next one on your left. We promise it will make you feel the same emotion, the same tears, and the same hope. It's a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat from the first minute. Your support with a like and subscribing means everything to us. Every subscription allows us to keep bringing you these moving stories every day, real stories that remind us of the power of love, redemption, and personal transformation. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our daily stories that will make you believe in the miracles of true love.